Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this drawing of a panda in pastels. Now this video is going to have lots of tips on how to draw white and black fur. Now to begin with, my biggest tip when drawing this fur is to have high contrast. So we want to be making sure that the darker fur is dark enough and that the brighter fur is light enough. Now making sure that we've got a range of the values of the midtones is what helps to create the softness. If we just purely focus on getting things really dark and then the highlights really bright, but we miss out those important midtones, then the fur can lack depth going forward. So when I work with the darkest part of the fur, I am using my darkest blacks that I have. It needs to have that bold layer in place first in order to get that good contrast. Now depending on the light source and how dark that fur is, I might work with a little bit more of a mid-tone layer and then add my darkest blacks to it. This is very much going to depend on the reference photo. But for this, because the black fur was really dark, I was able to use my darkest pencils first. Now as I begin to draw the white fur here, you can see that straight away I'm already using my lighter pencils. This again is going to vary depending on the reference photo, but I personally like to use my lightest pencils first if that fur is particularly bright. Now as I work on the rest of the panda's face, on the lower section where there's more of those warmer colours and those darker values, that there is going to really require a little bit more of a darker base foundation so that my lighter pencil strokes show up on top. But going back to the lighter fur here, you can see that I'm actually darkening this up in stages rather than just using a darker base foundation and then trying to put my lighter pencil strokes on top. Now, as I've said here, that technique and approach can work. It's going to vary depending on how light that fur is. But the reason I like to work with my lighter base layer when the fur is particularly bright like this is because I then know that I've got that fur as light as I potentially need it to be, and I can always darken it up in stages. This is the wonderful thing about working with pastels. Now at this stage I am adding more of my top layers, and I'm going to cover more on that aspect later on in this video. But I want to mention the importance of that base foundation. So when I start here on the top of the head, I'm really focusing on getting something that looks soft and out of focus. Now this is something that I do feel is very important to the layering process, especially when we're trying to capture a degree of softness in the fur. If I work with a base layer that has more start and stop points between the dark and lighter colours, I feel that that's then much harder to get that softness in the details going forward. So the blended layer that I'm establishing here is something that I do take more time to get right. And as you can see, I'm using a mixture now of my pastel pencils to target more of those specific areas that I need to either make darker or lighter, or potentially adjust the colour. Now this project is drawn on pastel matte, but I had already previously drawn this panda on the new Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet paper. I do have a side-by-side comparison video where you can clearly see the difference between the Canson Velvet and the pastel matte in that same project, so that I'm able to give as fair a review as I possibly can, and that video is live here on YouTube. I'll link that in the video description if it's of interest. Now one thing on the Canson paper that I did have issues with was layering my lighter pencils over my lighter layers. But as you can see here, when working with the pastel matte, I haven't experienced that issue. Being able to layer with the pencils in this way enables me to get more of that depth, rather than being limited with which pencils I can use or running into issues with that layering process. Now the more we use any new art supply, we get to have more of that confidence with what that can actually do and what are the limitations. So this is something that I'm going to continue to experiment with future projects that I have planned on the Canson Velvet. But back to the pastel matte version here, and I really want to be making sure that again I'm capturing a softness. You can really see that I've got no harsh edges at all, even between that subtle variation where the fur is at its brightest and then slightly darker between the eyes. Making sure that I'm avoiding that harshness at this layer I think makes a huge difference, especially when drawing white fur. Now white fur is one of those things that can make us potentially overthink that process. We sometimes assume that because it's white fur we have to just use our lightest pencils, but often that's not the case. There's many different variations of the grey tones, some warmer or cooler values depending on the reference photo that we need to use to make sure that the white pencils that we do have do show up. Now, for example, if you're using your white pastel pencils and they're not showing up, that is an indication that your base layers underneath aren't dark enough. So by darkening those up and then going back in with your lighter pencils, you'll be able to have more of that definition between your details. Now, another important factor, and this is a really big tip as well, and this could be applied to any medium, colour or grayscale such as graphite, is if you want your highlights to look brighter, but you've used your lightest pencil, or in terms of graphite, you've allowed your white paper to show through, and that still doesn't look bright enough, that is an indication that what's next to it isn't dark enough. So for example here, if I wanted the white fur between the eyes to look brighter, but I know that I've got that as light as I possibly can, then that might be an indication that the black patches around the eyes need to be darker. By darkening that, you're automatically adjusting the contrast and that lighter fur will look much brighter. Now, the other important factor here is to not force the white details. You can see that on the top of the head there, although I've been using my lighter pencils, the details are not as obvious as they are between the eyes. And that's because the fur at the base layers between the eyes is much darker. I'm going to have more of a contrast there. And this is what's going to help to get that balance of depth between that softness in the fur and more of those finer, refined, more obvious details. I don't want to make one area of my drawing sort of skipped past those layers of detail, but if there's not a lot of detail that's visible and it is more about the softness, I want to be making sure that I've got that balance right. Now, another aspect of drawing realistic fur is the pencil technique. Now, this is something that I talk a lot about in all of my videos here on YouTube, and of course my real-time step-by-step lessons, which if any of those are of interest, including this Panda, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. But the pencil technique, I usually focus on three main factors. So that's the fur length, the fur thickness, and fur direction. Now, I personally like to work in smaller sections so that I don't get overwhelmed by the drawing process. And by working on these smaller sections, I can then focus on those three things without rushing one or the other. Now, the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So I want to be making sure that I'm following that as accurately as I can in my reference photo. That goes with the same as the placement of the highlights and shadows. They're also usually following the structures underneath the skin. So for example, there may be a highlight or a shadow above the eye, and that's usually hinting at where the top of the eye socket curves over to the base of the skull. If those highlights and shadows are moved, then that is going to adjust the shape of that animal's face. So this is something that I'm always paying very close attention to alongside the fur direction. Now, the length of my pencil strokes is determined by how long that pencil is in contact with the paper for. This is something that I really focus on when drawing any animal, regardless if it's a shorter coated animal or a longer coated animal, because the fur is never going to be the same from one section of the face to the other. So for example, the fur on the side of the face here is much longer than the fur between the eyes. Capturing that difference between the length of the fur and that variety in our pencil strokes is going to increase the level of realism that we're capturing in our drawings. Now, as I start to work on the fur around the nose and the muzzle, this again is another great example of how the pencil technique needs to be adjusted. So the fur here is the shortest that it's going to be anywhere else on this Panda. So I need to be making sure that I have shortened my pencil strokes considerably to make sure that I've got the texture right. Now, if my pencil strokes remain the same length as elsewhere on the face, then this section of the fur is going to end up far more fluffy than it should be. So I want to be making sure that I have replicated this as closely as I can. Now, in some cases, if you're working on a smaller drawing, the area of fur here around the nose may not actually require length of pencil strokes. So potentially you might have to work with more of a blending and shading technique to hint at that shorter fur. But of course that's going to vary depending on the size of the drawing. If this was done on a much larger scale, 16 by 24 inches for example, my pencil strokes can have more of that length to it because of the larger portrait size. But definitely working on a smaller scale, sometimes here on that area for many different animals where the fur is really short, Sometimes the shading techniques work well and give more of a realistic look than forcing more actual detail. Now for the fur for the rest of the face, this is where my base foundation is going to change considerably compared to what I've used so far. So as you can see here, my PanPastels, and I'm using my round shaped soft tool to apply that, this layer is significantly darker than the top of the face. The only reason being is because this section of white fur is significantly darker and in shadow. So in order to get that contrast and depth of fur right, I need to make sure that I've got my base layer dark enough. Now when I start adding in my lighter pencil strokes here, you'll see that I don't just jump straight to my white. This is really important when trying to maximise softness and depth within any fur that we're drawing. Going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this video and the importance of midtones, if I jump to my brightest highlights too soon, those midtones are going to be left out and that fur is going to potentially have more of a wiry look to it because the softness at the in-between layers have been missed out. Now when drawing white fur, it can be quite daunting to have a base layer as dark as this, but it really does make a big difference in the level of realism that's achieved. Now of course, on the other end of that, we want to be making sure that we're not going too dark, because we want to be able to make sure we can lighten that fur up where needed. Now at this stage here, it's easy to think, well, all of these colours that are being used in this base layer process and for the midtones, I'm very rarely using white until I get to my last layers. How can that fur look white in the finished drawing when we've used so many other pencils in that layering process? But as you can see from a photo of my drawing in the corner, the white fur here, it still looks white, but it's got the depth to it because of the way that the shadow's being cast onto this lighter fur. So it's really important to make sure that when we are studying our reference photo, we're realising that that fur is hardly ever actually bright white. Now as I do like to work on those smaller sections, I don't ever get the very edges of that fur complete until I've got the section of fur next to it drawn in. So for example, the very lower edge of this white fur that sits in front of the neck, I'll actually come back and add those details at the end once this section of the drawing is done. This just again means that those fur details are going to look more realistic because they're being drawn in at the right time in that layering process. Now if we're working from good quality reference photos like I was for this panda, and the area of black fur just looks really dark with minimal detailing, then it is okay to replicate that in our drawing. There might be some situations where we feel like we could improve that level of realism by having a few more subtle details. But for this area here, because this section of the body was in a very dark shadow, I felt that it was okay to then draw it as it was. So in some cases here, the subtle highlights are only going to be on the very edge of the animal. There might be a couple of very dark midtones that I can incorporate, but I certainly don't want to be forcing highlights just to add in more detail or more pencil strokes. This is definitely one of those situations where on the black fur, less is more. Now when I do work with black fur that is as dark as this, I want to be jumping in with that dark pastel. I don't want to put in a mid-tone just in case I want to put in more of my lighter values. The wonderful thing about working with pastels, as you can see here, I can add in my lighter colours on top, even on my darkest base foundation. And again, I can't stress enough that if that fur is not as dark as this, you might not want to use your darkest black. You might want to increase that in your layering process. But if you do have areas of black fur from a good quality reference photo that are really dark, it's more than acceptable to use your dark pastel on your base layer stage. Now if you are drawing an animal with black fur that isn't as dark as this, that has some more of those details, midtones and highlights on top, I do have lots of other videos here on YouTube that show other examples of black fur, so I will link one or two of those in the description as well if they're of interest. Now of course the very last thing that I like to add are the final details, like those hairs that are sitting in front of the body and then the whiskers. These minor alterations can make a big difference to the level of realism that is achieved. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in drawing along to any of my real-time step-by-step lessons, then I will link the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.